Good afternoon, and welcome to the Product Realization Group Ask the Expert live series. This series today is going to be about commercialization risk. And quick introduction of myself. We're very fortunate to have Wayne Miller, who's an expert on both development and supply chain with over 30 years of experience. And then I also have over 30 years of experience in the development and the commercialization of hardware-based products. And when it comes to risk, what I found is a lot of companies underestimate risks that they're not that familiar with. So they tend to think about technology founders in Silicon Valley. They tend to focus on risks that they're, aware of and comfortable with. Those tend to focus on technology development, maybe a little bit of market, depending on who's in the business. And I want to focus today a little bit on what is a broader set of risks that companies in the hardware product development space should be aware of, and the seriousness that not taking these risks seriously can have on businesses. And you'll see as we go through some of these examples of what that looks like. And then once I go through some of these examples, I'm going to ask Wayne a few questions that we've prepared. And then following that, we're going to open it up to audience questions. So super excited about, going through this topic today. I've personally been involved in a lot of products that have underestimated some of these risks. And as you'll see when we go through the presentation, the impacts can be quite serious for businesses. So let's start with funding risk. So if you look at Scully Helmet, this is a few years ago. They were a very popular company on Kickstarter. They raised a bunch of money, and then on top of that, they raised additional professional investment to create this very sexy augmented reality motorcycle helmet. The problem is they weren't really able to develop the product to the specs in the amount of funding that they had, and eventually they weren't able to continue to raise money to support the product. So the result was, because they could not continue to raise money, the business really collapsed, and people that had pre-ordered these 3,000 helmets were just out of luck. So again, not all the way understanding funding risk and taking that seriously, and being able to successfully raise money for early stage companies can really be catastrophic. So the other thing I'll mention is many of these companies have multiple risks. So funding was not the only risk that Scully Helmet had, but it's the one I highlighted here. There's others going to be highlighted in some of these other examples. So I chose market risk for Pebble, which was kind of in the same era as Scully. They raised a lot of money on crowdfunding, and then they raised a bunch more professional money, and they had an innovative idea, but my perspective is they didn't really fully understand the risk of the market, given that there are these very large companies like Apple and Samsung that really dominated the consumer space, and they were trying to kind of innovate with this product. And what they found is they just couldn't compete against these larger companies when they came out with competing products. Part of the issue also, kind of in addition to market, was they were a little bit slow on execution. So by the time the product came out, it actually gave these other companies a chance to get ahead of the curve. And then once they came out, there really wasn't a lot of hope, and they ended up selling the business for a loss. Okay, and then technology, again, Silicon Valley, there's a lot of very innovative technology coming in this area. And Cylinder is a great example where they had a really innovative idea back in the day. They raised a bunch of money. This is just showing the amount of money they got from the government. There was many more millions that they raised from private investment. And the issue really was technology changed faster than their business model was able to keep up, and their competitive advantage essentially eroded away as solar panels got less and less expensive and easier to make, and eventually they just couldn't keep up from a technological standpoint, and ended up going out of business. So you can see from these examples that these risks really can be quite serious for businesses, and the takeaway is understanding all these risks can be really quite powerful. If you can understand and mitigate these early, it can really have a big impact on your business. So moving on to development risk, Samsung, everybody's heard of, great phones, but when it came to this Galaxy S7, they were just too aggressive on the schedule. They got this tremendous pressure to get these consumer products to market, and in order to meet the schedule, they were not so diligent on that validation and the verification that the product was not going to have issues in the field. And as a result of that, the product caught fire and caused a real problem in terms of the brand. They had to do a recall, very expensive, and at the end of the day, it cost them over $5 billion to support it, and they had a serious brand erosion as part of that process. If they had invested a little bit more, in that verification process, they could have avoided that huge, layout at the end. Rain at Risk. Rain was one of the companies when I first came to the Valley. I worked at, again, very innovative technology, bending a fiber optic cable in order to read and write a signal without having to break the fiber. So really kind of groundbreaking on the innovation side. The challenge that they ran into is they didn't do due diligence on the regulatory risk of this technology, where they could deploy it in a loop without breaking the fiber, but the risk that the regulatory body Belcor identified was if you break the fiber early in the chain, it knocks a whole bunch of customers off that loop. So it was not a viable architecture. And after 300 million invested, they had to do a full redesign of the product. Took another 2 or 3 years, and by the time the product was redesigned, they really lost their competitive advantage, and ended up having to sell primarily the IP for big loss to Ericsson over an 8-year period of time. So poo-pooing regulatory risk, not something you want to do, and also relatively easy to mitigate. You can do pre-screens and pre-checks before you go into these full development cycles. Okay, and the last one I'll talk about here, again, these are not all the risks, but these are kind of an example of the high level risks that I've seen and I think are pretty common when it comes to the hardware space. Boeing recently has been in the news, not in a good way. And if you go back to the 787, they did a lot of things to reduce cost. They dispersed their supply chain and design teams kind of at the same time, with the intention of saving money. But what they underestimated was how all these pieces would fit together, and really the risk of dispersing all these parts to different regions without really understanding the impact of how that would look once the plane went together. So they were way many years late, three plus years late in actually being able to ship the product. Estimated over 2 billion in lost profits, and as well as significant brand erosion. And that brand erosion continues today. If you look recently, they've had other issues. So this, I think, was an early indicator that Boeing has bigger issues. But supply chain really in this case was one of the bigger challenges that they had. And if they had taken it more serious, they could have avoided some of that risk, got the plane out to market faster. Okay. So with that, I'm going to run into Q&A, and we're going to start with a few seated questions where I'll go ahead and ask Wayne, really understanding the whole end to end. I might chime in with a few comments, and then once we go through these seated questions, we're very excited and happy to get questions from the audience. So let's start with development. So diving deeper into the development process, Wayne, in your experience, what have you done, to mitigate development risk?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. So just to get started, Wayne Miller, I'm with Product Realization Group now, and, I've got a lot of experience in product development, manufacturing operations, and I've worked in startups, small, large, and also larger companies over the years. So I've got a lot of experience kind of with the development process. And one of the things that we've done to try to mitigate risk is to have a structured development process. There's a lot of pressure in early stage companies to get your product out, to get it in front of customers, and it's obviously a really critical thing to do that. But at the same time, if you don't put the appropriate checks and balances in, the process, you can get, you can get into trouble. And I think, putting together that process is important. I think the other thing that's really important is to make sure that, you have a good team of people who are working on, the not just product development, but the verification of the product, and looking downstream at kind of how you're going to build the product long term. So I think it's really important to kind of make sure that you have that in the planning, because if you commit to customer deliveries before you're really ready, it can be catastrophic in how you bring the product to market, and then it's really hard to recover from that.
Great. Thank you, Wayne. And that really ties into this whole concept of proactive investment, where by investing a little bit more upfront, if companies put the work in and put the processes in, it really reduces total cost of ownership. It may take a little bit more money, a little bit more time, but the value, as you grow the business, can be really quite important. Okay, let's move on to field failures. We all know that field failures can have really catastrophic impacts. Looked at Samsung, Boeing, some of these other cases. Wayne, how do you minimize field operations risk during the product verification and reliability testing process?
Yeah, again, I think it all comes down to, making sure that when you come up with a verification plan, that you actually are, you know, you really put together a comprehensive list of things that you have to do. And I think it all starts with developing kind of requirements. What are the customer requirements? What are the engineering requirements? What are the, field requirements, et cetera? And I think that, if you're, you know, if you go through a comprehensive program and you make sure that you do that before you get things out to the field, it's going to improve your chances to have a successful implementation. I think the other thing that you got to do with respect to field operations is, you got to be careful about how you do that, because as an organization, especially if you're a smaller organization, it's important not to go too wide, because if you have to support the field, let's say across the country or something like that, and you're, a relatively modest organization, it's really hard to, support that area so well. So not only do you need to make sure that you've verified the product the way that it's going to be in the field, but you don't want to go too wide. So perhaps it makes more sense to try to do some local kind of field testing, before you go too wide, and make sure that you kind of walk before you run kind of a strategy.
Got it. And would you say it's important to have field service as part of that new product development team? Talking about kind of laying on that process you talked about earlier.
Yeah, for sure. I think, most importantly, you need to have people who have the voice of the customer, kind of in the room, while you're doing the development, while you're doing the planning for the field deployment. I also think that it's critical to have people who understand what it takes to support a customer, whether it's a field service kind of person or a customer success kind of person, involved in, the process. Because, sometimes when you're a product development person, you're thinking about the product, the design, the features, the function. You're not necessarily thinking about how the field is going to see that. And I think getting that additional perspective is critical.
Absolutely. And a few years back, I did a project with a company, and they did not have field service as part of that team. And they actually designed a product about six inches wider than a standard door frame. And as a result, they couldn't get the product in the door. And if they had had that person in the room, it would have been a very easy problem to fix. Yeah. So again, it goes back to getting the right people in the room at the right time can have a big impact on the business. Okay, let's move on to operations risk. Things like prototyping, early production, business systems, manufacturing, and supply chain. There's a lot to operations, but and you've run operations before, Wayne. When you think about operations risk for new product launches, what do you see as the biggest issues to deal with, and how to deal with those? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of aspects of operations risks, obviously. But, first of all, I think it's really important not to be overly dependent on the product development team to kind of build, these systems over time. I think that one of the things that tends to happen in, early stage companies is that there's a lot of dependency on the engineering team. And of course, the engineering team is going to be involved in product development, and there's always a challenge to have all the bandwidth required to kind of finish the design, make sure the design's working, make the updates to the design, getting the design files or information, the engineering information to whoever's building the product out there, and then at the same time trying to build it. So there's just the chicken and egg where there's only so much time to go around. So it's really critical to have the right team in place, and that doesn't mean you need to have a large team on the operations side, but I think it's important to have a good team on the operations side that can kind of work either to kind of manage the builds, to organize the builds, to make sure that the builds are being done successfully, or if they're outsourced, someone who's competent who can be participating with the suppliers to make sure that all the materials are there. Efficiency is a really important thing, and again, if there's too much dependency on the engineering team to purchase components or do assembly builds, there's just only so much time to go around. So I think that that's a really important aspect of it. I think the other part of this is to make sure that you have a process and the right systems in place to kind of be successful, so that you have the right planning in place. So whether an ERP system or another financial system to kind of place purchase orders, you have the right people chasing the parts, as opposed to just engineers building prototypes with their prototype suppliers, or supply chain, just to make sure that the appropriate planning happens. Because if you don't have all of these different functions operating at the same level, the weakest link in the chain will kind of break down, and you'll have to push out the schedule, which is obviously bad.
100%. And yeah, in my personal experience, I've seen a lot of companies, let's say, underestimate what they need to do from a, both an operations, staffing, as well as business process standpoint, and be very engineering centric. And while that can work in early prototype, as you get into scale, as you get into transitioning to manufacturing, as you mentioned, if you don't have the right people in place, if you don't have the right processes in place, it can really shut a company down as they try to go into some kind of a higher volume production scalability. So,
I would also add that when you're going through this design release phase, having the right level of documentation for suppliers or manufacturers to kind of work with, or even assemblers, is really critical. Because again, if you don't have all of the stuff documented, and there's multiple people working on things, it can be confusing, and they're building the wrong thing, and then all of a sudden you have the wrong thing, and you're trying to rework things or deal with things. So it's critical to kind of really make sure things are documented appropriately and rev controlled, so that you don't get surprises down the line.
yeah, especially I think as you move from local to offshore, if that's part of the strategy, the better the documentation is, the easier it is to do these kind of transitions. When you're building in house, it's generally not as big a deal. Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like ultra comprehensive documentation. I think it's really appropriate level documentation for where you are in the process. But you want to make sure that whoever is making whatever has to be made has what they need to be successful. So if you have certain tolerances or certain kind of operations that have to happen, or certain materials that have to be used, you just need to make sure that that stuff is there, and revision controlled, so that when there's changes, there's an understanding what you got.
Yeah, absolutely. And having run production for a number of years, the people on the floor are going to build whatever you tell them to build. If you tell them to build it wrong, they're going to build it wrong. So you got to be really careful about what gets pushed down the chain. So speaking of supply chain, kind of a good segue to the next topic, which is how do you've done a lot of CM selection and supply chain strategy as well as execution. How when you go about it, Wayne, how do you pick suppliers during the development process in order to kind of understand and mitigate risk?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different phases to product development, and there's a lot of popularity in kind of making your own parts these days with 3D printers, and just prototyping technologies that have come into the marketplace, and they're fantastic for getting a quick look at your product and an understanding of how it works. But I think it's really important to kind of pick suppliers correctly for each stage of your development process. So when you're building early stage prototypes, you're just trying to get some level of verification, you want to, you can use a lot of different techniques to get quick turn prototypes. But one of the things that I've seen over time is that, once you get kind of locked into some prototype supplier, it's kind of easier for the engineering team to just continue on with, that because it worked in the past, and it was easy for them. It's a low like effort kind of engagement for them to get more parts. The thing that you have to worry about and be concerned about is that if you take that approach, you got to make sure that the supplier can scale with the requirements. So if you have to build a lot of stuff and the supplier is really more tailored towards, small quantity, quick turn prototypes, maybe when you start building these things in higher volume, the critical dimensions and tolerance requirements are going to be a little more noticeable. You might find out things as you're building higher quantities that are going to cause you issues. So I think, over time, once you get into like EVT or DVT phases, you want to go to suppliers that are a little more appropriate for those phases and are going to look more like production suppliers where there's more complete documentation, more complete requirements on, the suppliers so that, you basically know what you're getting. And I think that, the other part of supply chain risk, is just, understanding, is the company that you're working with capable of scaling with you as your requirements build. So if you're building a consumer product and you have to build, I don't know, 500 units or something like that, is the supplier that supported you in that early stage going to be able to produce that, the way that you need, or are they going to run out of steam and then you have to kind of, at the last minute say, oh wow, this isn't working, so I think it's really important to have that roadmap and that supplier plan to make sure that, you look at all of the real requirements, whether it's volume, scale, tooling, ability to kind of measure, quality control, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's really important to kind of to do that in advance before you start doing large builds or production.
Yeah, yeah. Great answer. And I mean, that really sounds like what you're saying is, kind of right sizing, making sure you have the right supplier at the right stage of volume, at the right stage of maturity of the business is critical, and kind of laying out that strategy early, so you're not trying to build volume with a prototype manufacturer, which I've seen companies do that never end, that it can be never ends well, and also can be quite expensive. Prototype manufacturers tend to be a lot more expensive than volume manufacturers.
For
All right,
sure.
let's continue on the supply chain, kind of the theme here. And there has been a lot of increase in risk the last few years. Think about geopolitical risk, environmental risks, things like tariffs in China, and factories being shut down because of tsunamis and fires and floods. Uh, when you're thinking about supply chain, how do you look at resiliency, and how do you develop a resilient supply chain? And I would add also sustainable. That's also a big factor now, is resilience as well as sustainability.
Yeah, supply chain is a really complex thing these days. There's obviously a lot of push to get out of China, just due to all the political kind of turmoil that we're seeing. Uh, However, the reality is, over the last several decades, China has become like the world class manufacturer of stuff, and it wasn't always that way. I worked at Apple, in the '90s, in the early 2000s, and basically, we had started, where you had all U.S. suppliers or kind of non Asia based suppliers in the early days. And, we always thought, oh, these guys, China was low quality, et cetera. And, what happened over time is, they became a powerhouse, and, we kind of worked, with the bigger companies kind of worked with those supply base, and the government invested in their manufacturing infrastructure and really developed kind of a world powerhouse. And now in the last let's say 5 to 7 years, there's been a push out of China just due to political reasons and because of kind of world events. And you know it's really hard though to actually disconnect from China. So it's a really challenging thing. So what's happened is a lot of the Asian companies have started to evolve into other areas in Southeast Asia or in Asia so that they kind of get the China speed and influence, but not the China tariffs, et cetera. So I think it's really important to really think through this stuff. I think tariffs is another thing that I've seen a lot of impact to product cost over the years. So you have to stay like abreast of all of the tariff kind of situation to make sure that you understand the commodities that you're working with, and you're understanding what the tariffs for those things are and what they could be, because changing those things could have a dramatic cost impact in your product. And then I think the other part is, if you're to have an efficient supply chain, it's important to try to minimize the amount of material that you're building at any given time. So, again, planning, appropriately, and putting the right logistics kind of framework and lead times built into the model that you're developing on is a really critical part to kind of minimize material exposure and other types of issues. And of course, shipping stuff from far away is another thing that isn't the most sustainable kind of situation. So, there's no simple answer here, but I think that, over time, there's going to be more and more, supply chain, in North America, but at the same time, there's still a high dependency on China and Asia.
So double clicking a little bit, you mentioned there's a big shift away from China, or there's a lot of emphasis on geopolitical differences between the U.S. and China. What do you see as emerging areas outside of China that are, let's say, capitalizing on that shift?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of the big contract manufacturers move into Vietnam and India and Malaysia. I'd say those are areas that I've seen a lot of movement. There's a lot of suppliers in those areas, and it's been developing over the last decade or so. There's a bunch of stuff in North America as well. There's more low cost regions in the United States, and then there's Mexico that is also actively kind of growing, their supply base and capabilities. So, and I've had a lot of success also actually in Korea. There's just there's a lot of technical capability there, a lot of engineering strength, but also some manufacturing strength, and they operate very quick. The speed and cost and quality are kind of the things that are really critical with respect to supply chain. And I think that their speed and their quality in general is pretty good, and the cost is something that is probably still better than what we're seeing in North America.
Yeah, yeah, great answer. Well, thank you for that. And yeah, the other thing I've seen companies do is, if possible, develop parts that are as standard as possible that could be, made in as many different locations as possible, and then duplicate parts on your AVL, so your ability to get supply is easier.
Mhm.
So let's continue down the chain then and go in. Uh, well, the last question, past supply chain is kind of manufacturing, and what is your take on the whole manufacturing environment? I don't know if we wrote that question down, but I think you and I talked about it earlier. So kind of
Mhm.
end our starter questions with that, and then move into audience questions.
Yeah, I think the thing that we were talking about is internal manufacturing versus external manufacturing, and you know it's interesting because what there's been kind of a push I've seen in at least the Silicon Valley, that a lot of companies are starting to consider internal factories versus kind of the more traditional consumer electronic contract manufacturing kind of model. And there's a lot of reasons to kind of go one way or another, and it's an important aspect of things. And my view on that is, in an earlier stage company where you have a high complexity product, let's say, like a robotics product, or a complex battery storage or something like that kind of product system, large systems, also physically large. Uh, I think getting started, with internal manufacturing is something that should be considered. And the reason for that is, as you're developing these new technologies that may be complex, and you're really not starting with large amounts of volume, you develop knowledge about these systems and you learn about them and you can kind of work through a lot of these issues, before you actually have to scale it. But you still have to build large enough quantities to kind of prove the technology and to kind of verify it and even maybe get it out to some initial customer sites. There's just you know, uh, one of the other aspects of that is, sometimes when you're working with contract manufacturers, and you're in the development cycle, it's tough for them because, they're applying resources to your project and, there's a lot of, stops and starts because, the product development and, you learn things during the product development or the first builds and, they kind of lose their patience with you. So it's important to kind of stay close with external suppliers if you're in that kind of situation, but it's also interesting to consider just kind of owning it yourself. And, it's probably a lower cost scenario to kind of do it yourself, even though you might have to staff up some additional people inside the company to kind of support that activity. And then once things are a little bit more baked, you can make the decision, do we scale up our internal manufacturing or do we actually go outside to a contract manufacturer or another kind of supplier that can help you scale it? Because obviously there's a lot of things that are required to kind of build a big manufacturing facility, and a lot of the large contract manufacturers already have those in place.
Absolutely. And when you say build in-house, I'm assuming you're not talking about printed circuit board assembly. You're talking more final assembly. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say for sure that that's a much more typical thing to kind of outsource. But at the same time, it really all depends on your process and your product and what you need to do and what the volumes are going to be. But obviously the capital requirements is a key part of any kind of internal manufacturing. So if you have to put in $1 million PCB line to kind of build your early stage prototypes, it's not practical for most people. At the same time that there's a lot of unique products that might require other capital things like robotic assembly or their larger systems that you might have to put some capital in. And but the reality is, if they're unique custom things, you're probably going to end up paying for those whether they're inside or outside.
Absolutely. Yeah. And having run manufacturing, one of our selling points was amortizing this very expensive equipment over multiple customers, right? I think if you're only a company, unless you can really utilize this stuff all 24/7 sort of a scenario, it's going to be quite expensive. So
Mhm.
but these are all factors of going into make buy decisions, that kind of thing. So with that, I'm going to open it up to audience questions. We've got a chat. If anybody has any questions, really, anything about risk in the product commercialization process, from the beginning to the end, please feel free to enter in the chat. If not, we could continue the dialogue with me and Wayne. Happy to do that for another 5-10 minutes. uh, yeah. Well, while we're waiting for, there we go. We got a question. Okay. Uh, with field risk, how do you find a customer or partner to test the product or to do proof of concept? Okay, coming on the field side of things. Back to that.
Yeah, well, usually the best way to get something in the field is to have a real customer, right? And most early stage companies or companies with new products, kind of look to develop partnerships with potential customers, and usually as part of that, there's some sort of agreement, whether it's beta agreements or early customer kind of agreements that they're gonna allow you to kind of put the product into their kind of operation, whatever the product is, and you have a more detailed engagement that you would have if you just send something out into the marketplace. So I think it's really important to kind of put those things into place early on. So the the CEO of the company or the sales team is going to have to kind of engage with the customer and kind of set expectations. Usually, there's an agreement that says it's going to operate this way or potentially not operate the way that they would expect in the long term, and then kind of manage that relationship over time.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, I don't see any immediate questions, so I'm going to just keep on going a little bit stream of consciousness here. So some of the other areas I think that you have a lot of understanding, Wayne, that we really didn't hit on yet, revolve around kind of business process, business systems. I know you've done a lot of scaling. Not just products, but also businesses. But can you share a little bit more about how you go about understanding what business systems need to be put in place, how that ties into, phase gate process. I mean, it's kind of more the process side of scaling the business versus the product side of scaling the product.
Yeah. Well, I'll address kind of more startup like companies versus a larger kind of organization, which likely has you know uh, more advanced processes. But in my experience, obviously the place usually that it starts is like the CAD software that you're using to design the product, whether it's MCAD or ECAD systems, and obviously there's going to be interaction. There's going to be a team of people that has to develop products, and they're going to need certain tools to do it. And I think it's really important to try to move to a place where there's collaboration that's happening between the engineering and potentially the suppliers with those CAD tools. So you want to pick tools that have kind of PDM kind of capabilities, or the ability to kind of share the same model, whether it's MCAD or ECAD. And of course, if you can kind of make sure that there's connections between the ECAD and the MCAD stuff and go back and forth, you're going to minimize the design issues that could crop up if you don't have that stuff. And I think once you've got a decent design kind of baked, I think that probably the next and you've built some prototypes, one of the next phases is to try to put in some sort of change management. And I think that it's important not to go too hard on that too early, but at the same time, you need to document what you're building. And I think that it's really important to do that. And a system like a PLM system like Arena or something, I think was a great way to kind of get change management in there. I think the other thing that I think is a helpful tool is to have some sort of a product development process. And again, I think if you're an early stage company, you're not that big, you don't want to go too heavy on that. So I like to say like an NPI light process. That just again, you make sure that have a structure around what you're doing. What kind of product requirements you're trying to define. What kind of design goals you want to have. You know when you're going to do a build and what are the criteria that you want to develop when you go through that build, like an EVT build, engineering verification test build, et cetera. And then over time that would increase. And I think just defining what those things are is a really important thing. One of the things that I've seen quite a bit is you have a bunch of people join a startup who all have good experience working at good companies with good processes, but they're kind of different in different places. So you get everybody together from different places, and all of a sudden, everyone has their own idea about what the process should be. So I think just coming to an agreement about kind of what that is without going too far, I think is a really important aspect of it.
Yeah, 100%. And what I've seen is if people don't follow that, let's say the advice you're providing. I've seen a number of companies that have scaled rapidly with what I call silos of data isolation, and then by the time they scale, it gets to be really quite messy. So, hitting these things early, getting right partnering schemas, getting systems integrated, can really lay a foundation for scalability. If companies don't do that and then they scale, it can be really, really messy to try and fix that after the fact once they've already once they're already larger. So
For sure.
so proactive investment is a good way. We have another audience question, so let's go to that. How to reduce risk of groupthink or decision risk? I've seen field failures that can be traced back to timeline pressures where risks were not rigorously determined and failures were missed. sounds like a little bit like the example we gave of Samsung, where they kind of put a lot of emphasis on schedule versus really, proper testing, and then they got burned in the end. Yeah. So yeah, why don't you take that one, Wayne, if you want to take a crack?
Yeah, I think it's really critical to take a look at, kind of the failure modes that, could happen in your product. But but it all starts with like what the product requirements are, and really making sure you have a reasonably comprehensive set of product requirements, and then, kind of take a look and either do DFMEAs or other kind of methods to make sure that you are going to verify, all the things that you see as potential failures. And I think it's really important to have a structured process of failure analysis as well. So when you're building prototypes and you're doing your verification, making sure that you really understand what's going on and that you can kind of pull that back. And of course, I've been in a lot of situations where there's incredible timeline pressure because customer kind of shipments were committed or schedule commitments are there. And I think it's just really important to use data and in the analysis, and putting together real plans and making sure that everybody is considering that stuff.
Yeah. What it sounds like you're saying is, especially early stage companies are going to take on there's always going to be risk. It's really how to cohesively as a management team understand the risk and then weigh the trade-offs between, let's say, cost, quality, and delivery, to make sure that whatever decisions are being made, the company is aligned, and you're not putting it, let's say, any end client at real risk, right? The trade-offs and the risks are understood and being weighed properly.
Yeah, I mean, in general, the reason that you're pushing for these, aggressive timelines is because, there's some customer who, wants to get your product and you're trying to sell it because you're trying to get to a revenue point. And I think that, if there's enough data, available to show that, that's a bad idea, that needs to be structured in a way that can be presented back so that, it's it's just obvious that you don't want to proceed when you just have pure timeline pressures, right? So
Absolutely, yeah. And what the old saying is, what if you cut enough corners, you end up in a circle. So,
there you go. I like that.
so all right. So moving on to, we talked a lot about a lot of different risks, but we haven't hit much on the regulatory side. What's your view on, regulatory risk? And this could be in the high tech world, things like UL, FCC, EMC, and then in the medical, things like FDA, military, ITAR, et cetera. But kind of broad base. How do you view regulatory? How does that get planned in? When you look at the development through commercialization process.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just need to really look at it again from a big picture early on, especially with some technology startups. Some of these areas are just emerging areas, and the regulatory environment isn't necessarily known. Because it's a new space, and when you're in a new space, you're kind of potentially trying to figure out what the regulatory requirements are. And by the way, the regulators are still trying to figure out what those things are. So it's really important to kind of work with them early on to make it really clear, hey, these are the standards that we need to abide by, and what are the real requirements in the standards, because if you're developing some technology that isn't clear, then that can kind of hold you up. And it's a really important thing to do it. And then I think the earlier that you can get someone who knows about those requirements into the product development process, the sooner you can deal with it. Because if you don't consider some of these things, and then you go through an entire design cycle and you're building a bunch of stuff, and then you realize, oh wow, I missed this, that could be a very painful lesson to learn. So it's really important to try to pull that in as soon as possible. At the same time, you need to have enough of a product design to talk to these people, the regulators, or the people who could provide regulatory guidance. You have to have enough of a product for them to understand what they're looking at. So I think there's again a chicken and egg in that.
Yeah, and my experience in medical is, and I think it applies also to high tech, is this concept of what I would call pre-screening, in FDA, there's called a pre-submission, where you actually, you understand what the needs are and the requirements are, and then you prepare a submission to the FDA, kind of lead the witness. I think it can be done also in high tech, where you do pre-testing for EMC or FCC. And in my experience, companies that understand what the requirements are and then do some kind of pre-testing before they submit have the potential to save a lot of time and energy. The ones that just wing it and kind of hope that it's going to work out and then fail, end up going through multiple, at least from what I've seen, multiple iterative cycles where they have to submit and then they fail and then they submit again, and you can burn many, many, many months, if you don't get it right the first time. So, yeah. All right. Well, I don't see any other audience questions, and that kind of runs me out of the questions I had. Wayne, is there anything else, kind of last thoughts about mitigating risk, commercializing products that you'd like to share?
No, I think, just want to thank everyone for showing up. And, we, Product Realization Group is obviously available to try to help companies scale their products. And we'd love to kind of work with anyone who thinks they have a need.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Wayne, for your time. I know you're a busy guy, so appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to participate. I want to thank Jane for organizing all the technical, as well as everybody that's in the audience that was participating. We are going to make some of these Q&As live on YouTube, so stay tuned for that. You'll see that coming out. And if you do have any questions, feel free to email me. Give me a call, and happy to have a talk about anything here or anything related that you have around the product development process. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the share. And thank everybody for attending. And we look forward to the next Ask the Expert Live series, which should be coming up.